My name's George Hulse. I'm the president of the Toowong sub-branch RSL. I've got a story for you about the World War I combat engineers, and I'm sure you've never heard this story before. And the reason why I'm bringing it to you is that we're building a memorial bridge to commemorate those combat engineers of World War I. My name's George Hulse. I'm a retired Lieutenant Colonel from the Corps of Royal Australian Engineers, and I'm the president of the Toowong sub-branch RSL. I'm also president of the 1st Field Squadron Group, and we're a Vietnam-based association, and we're also called the Tunnel Rats back then, so that's my background. What I want to talk to you today is about a couple of incidents that happened in World War I that very few people are aware of, and yet had such a profound effect on one of the major battles ever fought in World War I. And this profound effect was delivered by Australian combat engineers in the field. So if I was to lift up a little map, I know it's very busy, but it's an actual battle map of World War I that our commanders had of where the Australians were, and on our right were the Canadians, on our left were the British. There's the Somme River up the top of the map, and right through the middle of the map you'll see a dead straight line, and that's a road that was put there by the Romans almost 2,000 years ago. It's still there today. So it undulates up and down, but it goes in a dead straight line. And it was along this line that the Australians advanced on the 8th of August 1918. It was the Battle of Amiens. And what happened was that at 4:20 in the morning, all the British and French and Americans rose up as one and attacked the Germans. The 8th of August 1918 was the day that General Ludendorff, the boss of the German army, said this is the black day of the German army in this war. He knew he was going backwards, and there was no other way for him to go, because on the 8th of August he was totally surprised and overwhelmed by the size of the attack that hit his forward infantry units, his artillery, you name it, they all got bashed. And at 4:20 in the morning, it was a pea super coming out of the Somme River. And so our troops, when they advanced, could hardly see anything anyway, but they were advancing behind an enormous British barrage from the artillery. And as they advanced forward, they were given 4 days to go from their start line, somewhere near Villers-Bretonneux, to an end line, which was called Harbonnières, and they did it in 6 hours. So they left before breakfast and they got to their end point before lunch on the same day. So they really stormed all over the German troops on the 8th of August 1918. But a lot of things happened on the way. And I'd like to just share with you now a couple of engineer stories, combat engineer stories. And the combat engineers are the guys that sometimes go out in front of the infantry, they go out in front of the armoured units, they protect the artillery, and what they do is they get rid of enemy mines, barbed wire, entanglements, obstacles, they search bunkers, they go down tunnels. That's what the combat engineer does. And of course the engineers build roads and other things and supply water, but the combat engineer is right up the forward edge with the infantry. And so on the 8th of August, we were advancing along the Somme River, and there was a real need to cross the Somme River with bridges. And so they had assault bridges with the combat engineers to cross the Somme River. And one particular group of engineers was sent forward, and they came to a little town called Cerisy. And Cerisy is a gorgeous little town down in the valley on the Somme River. But above Cerisy is what's called the Chipperley Spur, and that's a big hill that had lots of Germans and lots of guns. And in the first bombardment at 4:20 in the morning, the British guns had very little effect on the Germans on Chipperley Hill. So the Germans on Chipperley Hill had Cerisy dead in their sights. And when our lads arrived and the British arrived following the Somme River, the Germans were still active on Chipperley Hill. So one of our lieutenants took his troop. In those days they were called sections, but nowadays we call them troops of engineers. So he took his troop down to the Somme River, and he was told that he had to build 3 bridges, and he had to do it really quickly. And one bridge he had to build was called Cherry Bridge. And it was expected that Cherry Bridge was an old French bridge which would have been blown up by the German engineers. And the next bridge was called Sapper Bridge, which was going to be a brand new bridge. made of floating pontoons, and the other one was another bridge called Chipperley Bridge, and we knew that had been blown up by the German engineers. So when this lieutenant, Second Lieutenant Ralph Hunt, arrives with his troop of engineers, he comes to Cherry Bridge, and much to his surprise and delight, it's still standing there, no Germans anywhere near it, and they hadn't blown it up. So he seized it, crossed the bridge really quickly with his troop, and then went towards where he was going to put Sapper Bridge. But he didn't make it. He went a couple of 100 metres along with his bodyguard, if you like, his personal guard, a sapper, George Hook, and what happened was that they were caught by machine guns, and George Hook was very badly wounded, but Ralph Hunt wasn't scratched at all. So the lieutenant saw his soldier down on the ground, ran forward, grabbed him, and ran back with him over his shoulders. And there were machine gun bullets kicking up all around him, but unfortunately Sapper George Hook died of wounds, but Lieutenant Ralph Hunt wasn't scratched at all in that whole engagement. So he got back to Cherry Bridge and he thought, well, we're not putting Sapper Bridge across because it's smack in front of a German gun and we're just not going to make it. So he detailed off one of his corporals and 6 sappers and said, you guys hold the bridge, we're going to go and find somewhere else to put Sapper Bridge. And he left. And not long after he left, all hell broke loose to the north, about 500 metres north of this bridge. And the corporal thought, oh, this is not good karma. I'd better send 2 sappers up to find out what's going on. So he picked up Sapper Dean and Williams and said, go up there and find out if it's a danger to us. So away they went, 2 engineer sappers on their own, rifles and their kit. So they went through some boggy ground, and when they finally closed up to where 2 German machine guns were machine gunning everything out of the London Fusiliers, and the London Fusiliers were copping a hiding, and they were protected, the German guns were protected by a platoon of infantry, German infantry, and they were on the high ground, and the Brits were down on the low ground near the Somme River, and they were trapped in the crossfire of these 2 machine guns. So these 2 sappers looked up the hill and thought, we can't just leave this is bad, so we better do something about it. So using soldier skills, they crept up behind where the German machine guns were, and 2 sappers rushed them, throwing grenades, firing their rifles and screaming and bansheeing something loud. And the German lieutenant, when he looked over his shoulder, thought he'd been surrounded. So he surrendered rather than have all his soldiers killed. He didn't realise it was just 2 Australian sappers that had attacked his position from the rear. And as soon as all the hands went up, of course the Brits went forward quickly and captured the 2 guns and thanked the 2 Australians very much for their effort. So the 2 Australians were put up for the Victoria Cross, and it was Victoria Cross time, there's no question about it. But as it turns out, the highest level of the generals decided that they wouldn't get a Victoria Cross, they would get the Distinguished Conduct Medal, which is 1 medal below the Victoria Cross. Not bad, but not good for us. So these 2 sappers, when they came back out of the war, they both survived the war, disappeared into the community, and no one ever knew what they'd done. So here's 2 likely Victoria Crosses. They'd saved countless numbers of British lives and took a tremendous risk to go in and do what they did, but they weren't adequately, I think, decorated for their effort. So Cherry Bridge is still there to this day. That's what it looks like. I crossed it a couple of months ago before COVID-19 struck, and it's still there. It survived 2 world wars, and it's very much like the Eiffel design on things. So if ever you're in Cersei, you can cross the Cherry Bridge, as it was called in the First World War. So we go on. The day goes on. The Australians are roaring forward, and they get to a place called La Motte or Wafusei. And there are lots of underground dugouts that the Germans are working out of. And one is a command post, and it's under the main road. And so it was a case of engineers, dugouts, your job, down you go. And so a group of sappers went down, burst through the front door, and much to everybody's amazement, including the Australian sappers, there sitting down for breakfast are 5 senior German officers. they had no idea that their entire formation had been overrun by the Australians. So they were sat down to breakfast at 7 o'clock in the morning or whatever, thinking, oh, fine day, we'll get on with the war later on. And next thing, here's a bunch of Australian sappers saying, gotcha. And of course, the sappers made short work of the breakfast, didn't they? So they handed over these 5 German senior officers to the infantry, and the show rolled on. And as they went forward, further on during that morning, they came to a place called Bayonne-Villers. That's probably not how the French say it, but it's as good as I can manage. So Bayonne-Villers was being very hastily abandoned by the Germans. They realised that something big was about to hit them, so they left. Now, on one particular headquarters of the Germans left, they left all their maps behind, secret maps, operational maps, all their stores, all their dumps, all the stuff that was happening with the German engineers was all left behind. And so some sappers went in, they picked up all these lists and found out where every nut and bolt and railway line was that the Germans had notated and left for them almost like a gift. But they were in such a hurry to get out, they didn't have time to burn it, which is probably what they should have done. Thank goodness they didn't. It's probably a perfectly good chateau, but the Australian sappers captured that stuff. When they went on a little bit, their chief, the Australian Army Chief Engineer, came down personally and thanked them and congratulated them because it was one of the best intelligence finds they'd found for many, many months. And this was a beauty because now, instead of asking our engineer stores people to put forward all that engineer equipment, they just went forward into the German dumps and captured it and brought it back and used it. So our roads were totally choked, and if you can call them roads. So it saved our people a lot of time, effort and energy just by capturing the German stores that they'd overrun and using those. So then they go on to Harbonnières. And here we are, 6 hours downrange, and by the 8th hour after crossing the line, our soldiers had Harbonnières, and it was the 31st Infantry Battalion that captured Harbonnières. So they pulled up there. That was as far as they had to go. It was supposed to have taken them 4 days to get there, and they got there by lunchtime of the day that they left the start line.